Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So there's a poll. What kinds of conflicts recur the most in your organization or group? And you can see there it's multiple choice, racial equity, harm that someone did, strategy differences, personality conflicts, unclear decision-making or other. And you can drop any other in the chat so we have a sense, and then we'll officially get started in our welcome. So please go ahead and vote so we have a sense of what you're experiencing, living with, and dealing with.
Great. Still a few more coming in, so 5 more seconds to answer that.
Excellent. We have some in the chat. Clearly, power, union negotiations. And here's our poll. Looks like we got a good chunk here. A good majority is unclear decision-making, personality conflicts, strategy differences, and equity. Wonderful. Thank you all for participating and starting off with us this way. I'm going to pass it to Jean, who's going to officially get us started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ingrid. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first leadership webinar of 2022. It's great to be back with you. This session is called Into the Fire, Transformation Through Conflict. And you've already started to meet some of our presenters, Ingrid Benedict, Jovita Ross, and William Gadbian. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. We're going to share some resources they've created as the session unfolds. So grateful to all three of you for the work in preparing for this session and for all the wisdom that you bring to this space. Next slide, please. So let me just give you a few logistics. This is a 90-minute session. And as always, we are recording the session, including the slides. So we will send that to you within 3 business days, along with links to any resources that are mentioned in today's session. We always get your feedback after a session, and it's super important to us. It has directly affected the way we evolve this program. It only takes 3 minutes, so please stay. As we close the session, you'll get a pop-up survey that has 5 questions, and we value your feedback. For those of you who aren't members, just to let you know about our membership program, it's something that you can click on in the upper right-hand corner of our homepage. And I know that a lot of you are members, but if you're not, just a reminder that when you're a member, you get all of these monthly leadership webinars, as well as access to the whole archive and our digital magazine, which I think many of you have noticed under the leadership of our new editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez. Well, she's not that new, it's a year in now, is really evolving around our editorial line of racial justice, economic justice, health justice, and environmental justice. So you see some of the recent issues there. We welcome you to take a look at that. And there's our Twitter handle if you want to share feedback or ideas from today's session. So let me turn it over to our presenters. Next slide, and they're going to self-introduce and get us started.
Thanks so much, Jean. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really wonderful to be with so many of you to talk about conflict and tension. And I want to also appreciate you, Jean, and the team at MPQ for really prioritizing and creating a space for this conversation. My name is Ingrid, she, her pronouns. And, you know, last year marked for me 10 years of being a social justice consultant. I've been really blessed to be able to accompany and support leaders, organizations, alliances, and some of the donors that resource that work. With all of that, I consider myself a practitioner, and so that's what brings me here to share with all of you. And I need to imagine that we would be at a conference together, maybe at a lunch table or the lobby, or my personal favorite, which is the bar around the corner, where we would share stories of the situations that we're in, and maybe process and vent and share tools with each other about conflict or tension that's in our teams and in our organizations. And so to understand and to be able to live into conflict and tension is really important to me, because I've really have, you know, dedicated my life to really bring forward a vision of multiracial democracy. and an economy that's really grounded in dignity for everyone. I've also committed myself to a sector, the nonprofit sector and civil society organizations, because I fundamentally believe we have a particular role in bringing that transformation forward. Often when I do work around culture and structure, it's really helpful for me to think about the youngest person that I know. And I invite you all to think about that person and bring them to your mind's eye. For me, it's my niece who's 9 months. And I think about her at 90, and the world that she'd be living in. What I believe is that our nonprofits, individually and collectively, have a responsibility to transform the world that we're in now to one that we could be proud of, that the youngest little ones that are around us now would live into. And tension and conflict, what I've experienced and learned in 10 years of being a consultant, is that it can stop us. It can derail us from growing and from achieving our organizational missions and our collective purpose as a sector. So I'm here because I want to keep practicing how to approach conflict to better understand ourselves, each other, and to build organizations and that have the both culture and structure that's reflective of our values and this vision that we're all working towards. And I believe having a generative approach to conflict and tension is one of the ways, one of the many opportunities that we have for transformation. So that's why I'm here, and I'm glad to be all here with you. And let me pass it to William.
Hi y'all, how's my sound? Is it better now? You can hear me? Okay. It's so great to be here. I'm Wiam. I use they, them pronouns. I am Syrian. I live on Ohlone land in Oakland, California. And being Syrian is kind of informs why this is important to me. I'm the kid of folks who can no longer go back to Syria because of dissent against the dictator. For the dictator before this guy, actually. So it's like multi-generational dictators. And I mean, just that story of how someone who used to fight against the colonizers turned against his own people because he couldn't trust anyone else to share power, and had these huge reverberations in terms of like the amount of death and displacement that followed, such that Syrians are the second largest refugee population in the world. It really it's at the core of everything I do around social justice, is sort of seeing the extreme ends of how power can be used to harm other people, and like hungering for something different. So my name means harmony, and my last name means the angry one. So I feel like my mom always says that we have in our names some part of our destiny, and I feel like some part of my destiny is to support groups to find harmony through rage towards justice. And so I do that in lots of different ways. I created a tool with Jovita called the Turning Towards Each Other Conflict Workbook, which came out of like our war scars from years of working in nonprofits that were messy. And just being like, why does it have to be this way? There's another way, another world is possible. We just need a little, like some basic skills, right? So that sort of launched me into this world of supporting groups to build the skills and the muscles to take on conflict directly, so that we can bring forward a world in which we honor ourselves and the earth and each other.
And thank you, Liam and Ingrid. It's so good to be here with all of you. It's amazing to see over 200 people, almost 250 on this call. It gives me hope. Let's see, I do this work. Well, first, I'm Ashkenazi and Western European mutt, and I grew up in Northern California. I live in Ohlone land in Oakland now, and I grew up with a mom who was a solo parent, and I saw a lot of the impact of sexism and intergenerational gender-based violence in her life. And it never made sense to me, like, why is the world this way? It didn't make sense to me as a child. It still doesn't make sense to me now. And so that's what brought me into the nonprofit sector is joining groups who were working to address those things. I wanted to contribute to a world where no one ever faces violence based on who we are. And that's, both interpersonal and structural violence. And doing conflict work specifically, just to be frank, is because I had a hard time with it. And I kept running into snarls with the people who I shared a sense of purpose and commitment with. And, I had several experiences where our teams fell apart because we couldn't work it out. And I just felt like I'm a mess. Like, I don't know how to do this. and I need more resources. And that started me down this path. So I feel, it's a lifelong journey. I'm really grateful for the learning and practice I've had, and also feel still very much like a learner. So, and I think the three of us all share that. We're in this journey together. We're all figuring it out together. There is no such thing really as an expert in all conflicts, because every conflict has its unique dimensions.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you too. So before we dive into what we're doing today, we want to take a second to really ground and resource ourselves. We're going to be diving into issues like dominant culture and racism and equity and conflict. And these are all things that make us want to run for the hills, or at least me. So let's take a second. We like to begin before we share anything by grounding ourselves and turning towards why we're here and asking for some support. So I invite you to, if you are multitasking, I get it, but just take a second to close the internet browser, the email that you're working on, put down the dishes for a second, and just arrive here at this Zoom screen together. And take some deep breaths, if that's comfortable for you, and just come into your present moment experience, whatever that is. You might take in some of the visual field around you, if that's pleasant. You might feel the support of a chair beneath you. Just arrive. And holding the purpose of our time together, which is to explore the lessons of conflict for our groups, our organizations, our movements, to build a more harmonious world that's just and equitable. I invite you to really connect with your intention. What brings you here? Your deepest and most wholesome reason for engaging with this content today. What's your deepest why? It's important to move through conflict because and now I invite you to think about a who, a where, a what that you're in service to, that you're fighting for, that you love. Could be a place, a being, a child, like Ingrid said, or an ancestor, an ally, someone who's going to support you the next time you're in conflict. Just invoking them is supportive to you. And just bringing them to mind. And allowing those images to fade away and coming back to the shared Zoom space of this call. I would love you to drop in the chat what came up for you in terms of your why and your who or what. We'd love to hear. For me, some of the Syrian nonviolence warriors who passed away in the early revolution came to mind, and just their like willingness to put everything on the line to protect the place they loved and the people they loved. So love to read what you all have to say. I'm seeing some family members, climate change and protecting the earth, relationships, meaningful connection, children, connection is on the other side, tired of feeling stuck and powerless. Beautiful. Thank you all for taking that moment to ground in why this is real for you. I'll pass it to you, Ingrid.
Thank you. And thanks to so many of you for sharing your own motivation and inspiration and intention. A little bit about what you can expect today. So we came together because the three of us work in different parts of movement ecosystems. My friend Maura, who's also a teacher to me, often talks about consultants as interdependent. We're all in different parts of this ecosystem, all trying to work and support organizations and all to achieve their visions and purpose. And inevitably, there's always conflict. And we've all experienced that. It could be a staff meeting or like a staff retreat or even in a one-on-one where something could be called out and boom, like conflicts in the room. What we do in those moments is really what we try to design and share with you all today. And what we are going to do is start off with some definitions and then dive into some common experiences with conflict and equity. And we'll lift up some specific practices and frameworks, both for ourselves and also for our groups that can support us with navigating different scenarios and situations. I'll pass to you, Joe.
Yeah, we just want to acknowledge that we won't have time today to do a lot of application or trying these practices on. And we really want to encourage you to do that because it's through the practice, through the application that we bring them to life. And so really appreciate you taking the time today to be here. And we invite you to take these practices home and into your work and apply them in your own world.
And we're focusing a lot of today talking about equity because dominant culture shows up everywhere and it shows up in every conflict that we have. It could be implicit or explicit. So we're focusing today on how conflict can be a pathway for achieving greater equity, both interpersonally and within our organizations. And I'll pass to you, Liam, for sharing some definitions.
Yeah, so that's like a major theme of today is like, can we start to think about conflict as a portal towards what we want, not just like a hurdle, but like something that can actually quicken and take us there like in a more deep and aligned way. So could we go to the next slide? So before we dive in, it feels important to sort of clarify what we mean by conflict, because there's a lot of confusion about this, right? And that sort of can amplify resolvable conflicts into like much bigger tangles. So when we say conflict, we mean run-of-the-mill disagreements and differences that could be around needs, values, strategies, resources, and of course, relationships to power. It can be personal, political, or structural. And almost always there's going to be power and privilege at play in every single conflict that you have, right? And that doesn't mean that it's like abuse per se. So abuse, what do we mean by abuse? Abuse is behaviors, whether they're physical, emotional, sexual, or other, intended to really control people, right? To maintain control and power over people. And that can be interpersonal or something as intense and extreme as sort of intergenerational structural violence, right, that many of us have experienced. And so it's important for us to differentiate between these two, because the practices that we use for conflict are not going to work to resolve abuse and intergenerational structural harm, right? And vice versa. The practices that we use, like for power building and community accountability and transformative justice, are a little bit overkill for conflict. And that's kind of part of the reason why Jovita and I created the tool that we did, the Turning Towards Each Other workbook, is because people were like, transformative justice practitioners were like, can you stop calling me for like just a regular argument? Like, can people not just learn how to deal with that on their own? We don't need a whole circle for that, right? So, and then to articulate one other distinction, which is harm. So harm can happen in both conflict and abuse. In the harm and abuse is much more extreme than in conflict. But, and so it's just, harm is just suffering essentially that needs support and healing, whether that's from practitioners or the earth or community. Yeah, so we wanted to make those distinctions. Feel free to drop in the chat if that resonates, if you have alternates. And I also wanted to shout out, we took these definitions primarily from Adrienne Marie Brown's book, We Will Not Cancel Us, and also influenced by Mariam Kaba of Project Nia.
Yeah, and so we can go to the next slide. So oftentimes people think of conflict as a communications issue because that's when it tends to erupt and become visible, is in interpersonal exchanges. And typically, commonly, there are actually multiple layers of things going on in any given conflict, including equity, as we've named, power relationships. And we want to start actually with our relationship with ourselves, even how we're feeling about ourselves in any given moment, how we relate to our own needs, how we relate to caring for our own well-being. All of those things are sense of purpose. And, the grounding that Liam offered is one example of a practice that can help us be clear about our purpose even when we face tensions and conflict. And then the next layer is the quality of our relationships overall and how we care for our relationships with each other. And so things like actively expressing appreciation to each other and understanding, like, why are we here together? Those kinds of things, having caring for both ourselves and our relationships with each other will help us navigate tensions and difference and interpersonal tangles when they do arise. And they will arise. It's part of being human. We all make mistakes. Our messiness is part of what makes us beautiful. So we just want to normalize that. And all of that is to say, we're today not focusing on communication specifically, but on the deeper parts of the conflict iceberg and particularly how they interrelate with questions of equity and power. Because doing that deeper work will help us navigate those tensions when they do erupt. And I will pass it back to Ingrid.
Thanks, Jovita. So we would like to take another poll to just get a sense of how you all tend to approach conflict. So there we go. Do you avoid it or confront it? And let us know which one you may be in the poll. And as we're allowing folks to, I see is work around it an option, somewhere in between. That one of the opportunities that we have as leaders in the sector is that we have the opportunity to really shift our mindset around how we think about conflict and how we view it. And it's important for us to understand and have some awareness of ourselves. And we can see here in the poll, we have about 57% saying that we avoid conflict and 43 saying we confront it. And so we have a good mix here. We have a lot of things we could learn from the folks who are confronting it, the ones that avoid it. For us to really be able to, and I saw it on the chat that someone really liked that the framing that we've talked about, which is seeing conflict as a portal. Can be a moment of acceleration, right? Regarding change and values and strategy. And to be able to do that, we need to have an awareness of how we might react. And to be able to really recognize that a conflict, I've learned to really appreciate conflict because that means there's truth and honesty happening. So that's one. And if I'm in a space where there's actually no conflict, I'm actually quite worried that the depth of relationship isn't allowing some things to surface. So how do we see conflict as insight into a group, information that maybe our values aren't really being experienced by everyone in the same way, or we might be articulating something as a set of values, but actually not living that within our organizational systems and culture and processes. So both what we want to lift up is both the practice of shifting our mindsets and the opportunity that we have as leaders to really create organizational culture that sees conflict as an opportunity and quite honestly really designs for conflict, to recognize that conflict will happen. And an opportunity that we have is to have like a shared policy or practice for when tension or conflict will arise, versus working towards not having it arise or trying to avoid it when it does. And so what we tried to share today is really that idea that conflict is a portal for deepening our commitment to equity and aligning on our values and our vision and strategy. We want to share with you a scenario and some tools and frameworks as an offering. And it may be a scenario that might be familiar to some of you, either from your own experience or you've observed, and we welcome you dropping a +1 as we share it. And that's the scenario of an organization that hires a leader of color. And that leader of color as an executive director may come in after a white executive director who may have been there a long time, may have been there as a founder, and as a way of really addressing issues of racial equity and these hopes for diversifying the organization, there a leader of color is hired to step in. And the new EDs often aren't supported to make the broad shifts that are really necessary for lasting change around racial equity, because that is both cultural and structural work. And the organization may be destabilized. The ED is then blamed for not achieving a goal that they actually didn't have the resources or support to really see happen. And we think about a transition as a person and not as a transition of a system. And our organizations are systems that have culture and structure at work. I don't know if you all have seen this, where also the ED sometimes gets fired and blamed for that. And so that situation, unfortunately, has happened. And I see some, unfortunately, +1s. Another element to this is that the board then gets responsive and hires a diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI expert or consultant who might come in and do a series of listening sessions with staff. And then, of course, you may have to relaunch a whole search process. And the board may consider this as a resolution, whereas the staff and the leadership are having a completely different experience of what's happening. And those are moments of real tension and conflict in an organization. And what do we do in those moments is some of the tools and frameworks we want to share. I'll pass to you, Liam.
Yeah, so that's like one composite example of like many ways we've seen equity conflicts mishandled at a structural level at an organization, right? So feel free to drop in the chat or in the Q&A if you have other examples of like themes that you've seen. We'd love to hear from you about what it looks like in your experience. So when we talk, we're going to be talking about dominant culture and conflict on an interpersonal and on a group and organizational level. And when we say dominant culture, we mean the structural power patterns that more broadly organize all of life and our resources along the lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, etc. And they show up in everything we do. And I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to, like, that even if you're a BIPOC person or someone who is marginalized based on these dominant culture patterns, you are likely to reenact them either internally or to others because, and it's not personal, it's not your fault, it's just the water that we swim in. It's like this toxic river that just takes us along in its undertow. And unless we're actively practicing against the stream, we're going to be enacting its patterns in our work. And so we, in the article that we wrote recently, we talk about how we as organizations often entrain to the bigger dominant culture flow that we have to interact with. So nonprofits are often interacting with dominant culture institutions, either because they're trying to transform them or they need funding from them or whatever, whatever it is. And so rather than you can entrain to a system that's toxic, or like you can be the system that others entrain to, right? You can create a regenerative culture that other people are syncing up with. So one practice that we, Jovita and I, bring to organizations to support with that on a group level is could we share the next slide? Talking about dominant culture characteristics. And this is based off of Tema Okun's white supremacy characteristics. And so we have them grouped here as we do in our workbook, and they have to do with exceptionalism, power and control, external validation, binary thinking, and it sort of lists out pretty in a way that's easy to understand how these dominant culture patterns show up in our organizations. So what we do is just step one, bring this language, this shared framework to the group so that we can depersonalize it and begin to have a shared language to work from and to identify the problem. So like each group or organization tends to have its own like white supremacy cocktail that is like its unique habits that are the most strong. I mean, we all have all of these probably, but in some groups it's really power hoarding, and in some groups it's more urgency and the inability to delegate or whatever. So we start off by just introducing. So that's one practice, to introduce these characteristics, to use them to identify what is not going as we would like it to. What's the status quo sort of toxic river version of how we operate. And then we bring in, next slide, we start to generate some ideas for ways like micro practices that we can apply as a group to address our sort of white supremacy cocktail. And starting small, really, like, for example, for a group that has a lot of urgency, one practice they might commit to that they could apply right away is like, let's do a really thorough debrief after every big campaign we do. So we take a moment to breathe and really integrate rather than like move on to the next thing. And that's something that folks can like start to apply right away. So that's one practice that we offer. I'd love to hear from folks in the chat if that's something that you all do or are aware of, or how that resonates, and how you might take that into your work.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of resonance in the chat, and some really meaningful examples. Folks are sharing things like intergenerational conflicts and you know, part of the reason, as Liam said, this is based on Tema Okun's work with white supremacy culture. And part of the reason that we named it as dominant culture characteristics is because these are patterns we see showing up in many areas of difference around power. And so it might be intergenerational, it might be around gender. There are many ways this shows up, and there are these common themes. Liam, are there anything else you want to lift up from the chat?
I'm just seeing that folks are liking the idea of micro practices, that micro practices add up. Step by step. I'm seeing that some folks were turned off by the language of white supremacy culture. I wonder if dominant culture patterns might be a way to say it, that includes, like Joe said, the many axes of power that are at play. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, thank you. You're anticipating my next move. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So sometimes when we start paying attention to equity and power internally to our organizations because something painful has happened, and it's easy to fall into urgency around that, like, oh my God, we have to address this right away. And you'll note from what we just touched on that urgency is actually one of the dominant culture characteristics, and can actually get in the way of truly addressing the underlying issue. And it can bring us to more of a Band-Aid solution. And so when we do equity work as a Band-Aid, we treat it like an add-on rather than understanding how it's really connected to our essential purpose, what really brings us together. And so what's up on the slide now is one exercise that we offered in Turning Towards Each Other to support us in clarifying together what is our essential purpose, what brings us together, why are we here, and what is our real vision for change. And so an example that I've experienced around how equity connects with essential purpose. I lead an organization called Real Food, Real Stories. And when I first joined the organization, there was an existing commitment to including what had been articulated as marginalized storytellers in our work. But there wasn't a shared, clear understanding of why that was important. And it was through doing this clarification of purpose and vision that we named together that given how settler colonialism and enslavement shaped the current inequity in the food system, that our work to transform food has to include a commitment to shifting racial power dynamics. And so now we have a clear commitment to centering Black, Indigenous, people of color, food culture bearers, and change makers in our work. And so that gives our equity commitment a meaning, and it's clear that we can't do our work without that. So that's one example. Before I move on, anything you want to add or lift up, Liam? Or Ingrid?
I also wanted to invite folks, if you have questions about the applications of these particular practices we're naming, to please put them in the Q&A so we can track it a little bit more easily than the chat.
And I'll add something here, Jovita, that I see there's a question that I think we can dig into more later. And this question, if there's like tension between BIPOC leaders versus white women, and this came up in the Q&A. Using this compass as an opportunity to actually sort of talk about and to underline, like, what do the vision and the values mean, like, within our organizations, and to allow the fact that we might all have a different role to play, and we all bring different lived experiences to our organization. Creating a space where those lived experiences are valued and are integrated in our process feels really important. I don't subscribe to what I think also is in the question, this idea of oppression Olympics, which I think sort of activates some other thoughts and questions. But that I guess I would just add that working in multiracial organizations for most of my life, we all have different work to play, actually. And affinity caucuses are a really helpful tool that really allow different communities within organizations to really have the time with each other to really define, like, what do the values mean to us in practice? What do they mean to us as they're written? And just that process of actually unpacking our values, I've always experienced it as a transformative moment in an organization. So I just wanted to add that the values and the practices and the vision are helpful tools to really guide a series of conversations with a diversity of people within our organizations and within our teams. William, I saw you came off mute.
I think you sort of answered this question that I saw in the Q&A, which is sort of like, what do you do when people don't think that having these conversations is around, vision, purpose, values is relevant or needed? Joe, do you want to just maybe shout out one more thing about that? Like,
I honestly can't think of a time I've had to convince people to do it. I will say that in both that's not true. When as a consultant helping groups with strategy, I've had to convince people that it's worth taking the time to do this. And a lot of times when people want to skip over this step, it's because they're like itching to get to the real strategy. One thing that I share is that sometimes it feels like we're going slower when we do this foundational work, but it actually allows us to exponentially speed up. Like, once we're on the same page here, it makes strategy work together much more possible. And in fact, I sometimes call this tool, even the reason is the illustration is a compass symbol, is that I call it a strategic compass, because having clarity on these points helps us steer.
Yeah, and so many conflicts. I mean, we talked about other conflicts that come up in organizations and tear organizations apart that are around non-clarity of purpose. So being able to land that is a discerning boundary that allows you to then move forward without getting stuck for ages, like you said. Yeah, do you want to move on to the next practice, Joe?
Yeah. I think that can bring us to the next slide, if I remember right. Oh no, not yet. We can stop the slides for now. At the top, our first poll, you all told us that the place that you are most seeing conflict is between leadership and frontline staff. And a lot of times that's around decision making. And there's two kind of patterns that I've seen in organizations around decision making. One is either we replicate structures that we honestly want to change in the world, like taking management practices from plantations and from factory floors, or we go in hard on trying to design like the perfect power neutral structure. And the reality is that humans are not power neutral. Like, power is always shifting. We each bring different assumptions about power into every relationship we have. And so that exercise of trying to design a structure that's power neutral is a huge time suck because it's not actually possible. And so we want to encourage you to instead be exploring decision-making models that are power aware, that are transparent about who makes decisions, why, and to also remember that at different points, different decision-making practices may be useful. Like, so within the same group, there are maybe decisions that need to be made by consensus, such as what is our essential purpose? Like that's, unless you're like a sole proprietor business where, you know, the person who started the business asserts the essential purpose, essential purpose is something that you need to agree on together. So that requires consensus. But not every decision requires consensus. And actually it's useful to, the word is escaping me, to give ourselves and each other permission to actually move forward, to make our own calls when we have agreement on purpose, vision, values, and who we're accountable to, and we have a shared understanding of what that is. Then we can say, like, okay, Ingrid, I know you're going to run with this, and you get to interpret those agreements we made into your everyday decisions, and you don't always have to check with us on every single thing. So we offered some resources for that in the blog post that went up earlier this week, and I have a suspicion that there will be more questions around this.
Well, and so the reason that we're talking about this in the context of, you know, equity and conflict is that when there's unclarity, when there's fuzziness about who gets to decide what, guess what seeps in? It's dominant culture. It's like, you know, all of a sudden the people with more position, you know, power along lines of race, gender, class, etc., might take up more space and feel more confident to go in and do what they're supposed to do. And then the folks who are marginalized based on those identities are like, I don't know, I have a lot of experiences of oppression that teach me that I cannot make these decisions, and that I could be penalized for making the wrong one. So maybe I should take a step back, and there can be like, it feels oppressive. I worked at an organization where that was the case, and the person was just like, the person was identified as a BIPOC person, and they felt like it was racism at play, you know, and it was racism, and also just like lack of like an explicit green light that you can, you know, make this kind of decision. Yeah, should we take a moment and look at any questions that might have come up around this?
Yeah, I just want to lift up, Jean put in the chat Cindy Suarez's work, the book, The Power Manual, and it's really excellent. If you haven't checked it out, I really encourage you to pick it up.
One of the things I'm seeing is that first of all, thank you for that outlining of decision making. And I want to underscore that the workbook, the article and the workbook have really concrete resources about decision making, which was the number one, I think, issue that, as you said, in the early poll. So thank you for that. This issue of agreeing on values, but then disagreeing on their prioritization or their manifestation, right? So I think a lot of groups have gone through processes of naming values. But then this work you're doing about practicing and actually getting in conflict about does this project or way of doing something express those values? And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about how do we then work with the values in real life? If you complete this compass, the conflict comes right in disagreements about their expression, doesn't it?
I also saw this particular question around like someone who thinks X is more important than Y in their, like in what the organization is going to put at the center. And Joe, I feel like this kind of connects to some of your past experience. And also Ingrid, if you have any thoughts on that particular kind of conflict.
Yeah, I was going to add, thanks, Jean, and thanks, Miriam. I was going to add, well, one, I think just I've been scrolling so many of these questions. I feel like they themselves are like an hour-long webinar to discuss. I feel the richness of the experience. And the, I think the beauty here, the commitment here is to both revisit our values on a usual basis that actually is outside of like strategic planning, right? Which is usually when I'm usually asked to partner with an organization and there's like, we want to do a strategic plan, and then we really look at the values. I guess I just want to lift up the fact that we're in a moment of complete structural breakdown. Every system that has constructed and shapes like our everyday experience is closing down. It is an immense opportunity, and I'm so glad to see so many folks, right, plus one, to revisit our organizational identity, your theory of change, your vision, purpose, and values. And I don't know if as someone who's facilitated and supported, it is actually in the distinction about like which values, one, like let's stop having 12 values, right? But like which are sort of the dominant and primary values for the culture that we're building in our organizations. And I actually think that the part that I've always loved doing in facilitating those processes is actually how do we live them individually, interpersonally, and organizationally, and developing a set of practices and commitments that we hold in all of those. That I think, and I'm curious what Jovita and William, what you would say from your experience here is that I'm actually not trying to have consensus. That the process is a collaborative one, right? So everyone's voice is important, and everyone can feed in and share their life, their lived experience and the diversity of that. But I guess I would sort of resist this idea that like one has to be always primary over the other. We live intersectionally, and our values do too. And so I think I would try to push back on that, and sort of I'm as I read the question, I was curious on like, well, why are we pushing for the dominance of one value over another? And that tendency and practice to me also really sort of reflects sort of the habits of white supremacy. And so like I want to sort of resist that and both sit in a place of intersectionality and as Monica Dennis, the simultaneity of the things that we believe that have to happen at the same time. And just to say that I think having supported and facilitated these processes, I think that the challenge that I've seen and experienced in organizations is that we don't actually allocate enough time. We don't actually allocate enough time that's really required for the depth of conversation to really, utilize a tool like this compass. And I just want to lift up to the folks here that actually have some leadership and authority to really think about what's on your organizational plate, and to give more time to this, give more time for individuals to reflect on it, give more time to your teams, and it can be a transformative experience, and you can come out of it so much more deeply connected with each other and your shared purpose. I'll pass it back to you, William.
I feel like the thing I took away from what you shared was like, I really don't care what the values are on paper. Like, I really don't. Like, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad we all agree. These are the ones on paper. And I think I saw this in the chat too. Some people are so intently wedded to them, but it's like like you said, actually, are they alive? And what are the practices that are going to bring them to life in our organization? Rather than like, I remember I was in this feminist collective of Arab women and non-binary folks, and we did this elaborate Google Doc of our core values. It was like it was just like such a long process, and like by the end of this many-month process, I quit because I was like, I hate working with you. Like, none of us practiced the values that we spent months articulating in this document that looked really pretty, and I'm burned out. So that's what interests me more is like, yeah, what are the practices bringing them to life?
Yeah, totally agree, and definitely agree that it's not always useful to have consensus on values, and because you can spend a lot of time like wordsmithing minutia. And that spending the time actually checking in on how is our work together feeling, like where is it feeling good and energizing and like purposeful, and then where are we feeling tensions and uncomfortable rubs, and normalizing having that conversation, like where is the uncomfortable rub. And in the team that I currently lead, we do that seasonally. So we have, 90 minutes to 2 hours once a quarter, where we share, before coming into that session, we each collected our thoughts in a worksheet around like highlights from the last quarter, and then also like where are the tensions that we're experiencing, so that we can make adaptations in our working agreements as we go along.
You're really good at that seasonal reflection stuff, Joe. I appreciate that. Did we move on? Oh, sorry.
Can I add just one thing? Ma'am, that one of the opportunities or like challenges I feel that we're in is, like when I first started in the nonprofit sector and I look back on, those first couple jobs, like the values were in like a document somewhere on paper, okay? And then we moved to the cloud and G drives and Dropboxes, and sometimes they exist there. And then sometimes they're visible on our website. But, we're in this moment where like, I'm sort of always trying to be curious about what are all the ways that we're capturing our values and using them as a way to really energize and re-inspire ourselves. Because I don't know about y'all, but this work is hard. The work is hard. We're in a hard moment, and so I'm sort of, like, can we create short videos? Can we, use TikTok and Instagram as ways to really talk about our values and make them more of a live way that we're connecting with each other? One of the experiences that I've had, just like two weeks ago, I was speaking with an executive director where there was conflict between two senior leaders, and the conflict really erupted. And when we were speaking just 2 weeks ago, and she said, actually, well, everything's really calm now, so I don't think we need to do anything. And I shared with her, I said, everybody else who wasn't a part of this conflict is watching, right? And as senior leaders, as an executive director, if you say nothing, then it makes that behavior permissible. And actually to avoid conflict even becomes permissible because it becomes organizational practice. And that one way to interrupt that is to actually sit and talk about how are we going to treat each other when we disagree, why our tone matters. And I don't know about y'all, but even texting, like, why, I've had someone say, why are you yelling at me? Because I forgot the cap lock, like, I'm not, like, we're just in this opportunity, I think, to just think creatively about how we share and live our values. And I think I'm really drawn to that idea of them, living on the website, but maybe it's in a video or it's in a series of books that inspire us, or music or poetry that actually reflects our values. Like, how do our values really guide us every day, and really inspire us to like keep going? Because I feel like we also need to fill that tank up of ourselves individually, and also the folks that are in our teams. So I just wanted to add that.
That's the perfect segue to the sort of self practices that we wanted to talk about too. I saw some folks be like, are we going to talk about just like me as a person, not just as an organization? And yeah, it's like our values are alive in us. Like, sure, we can have all these reminders, but it's really, how do we like embody them? How do they move through us and express into the world? And so one practice or framework that we offer folks for shared language around different relationships to power in a conflict is this 4 archetypes framework. Can we go to the next slide? So this is a framework that a teacher of mine, Gitanjali Hemp, offered. And what it articulates are 4 common relationships to power that we experience in conflicts and in equity issues. And the sort of genius of this framework is none of these like ways of relating to power is any better or worse than the other. It's just helpful to know where you're at in the map at any given time and to not get stuck in any place in particular, and to know what practices will help you move through that place. So I'm going to just try to like give you an example and move through the 4 so you have a sense, but it's in our workbook and you can learn more there. So like, let's say the first one, victim, it's that experience of kind of like overwhelm. Like, so maybe someone is trying to introduce some more equity into the purpose of your organization, and folks who have entrenched power may go through an experience of overwhelm, like, this means I'm gonna have to do things differently, or I'm, like the way I thought we would be is not the case anymore. And that experience of victim in that case is not necessarily like an accurate one, because that person still has a lot of power. There are some experiences of victim that are actually like truly real. But regardless, that person is in that experience. And it's useful to know that when you're encountering someone in the victim archetype, they're not going to really be able to make proactive steps towards their like the highest vision of the group. They just need some support at that moment. So the key practice for that space is like getting resourced, getting support, caucusing with folks who are like you to move through it if you have more positional power than you realize in that moment. The warrior archetype, like this archetype might have been embodied by the people who were like, we need to bring more equity into our core purpose work, like enough band-aid solutions. This is the archetype, the relationship to power that's like, I have dignity and I deserve to have my needs met. And it's both beautiful, and then if you get stuck there, everything kind of becomes a battle. So it's good to know, like, okay, in my group, there's this person's in victim, this person's in the warrior archetype, and then there's the leader healer archetype, which is the sort of like the pros and cons of any leader is embodied in this archetype, which is like, this is the guy that's like used to maybe being in a slightly more resource space, is used to like having access to some power. And then the pitfall of getting stuck here is like, they don't want to then deal with the demands of the victim and the warrior archetype. They kind of put people at arm's length. And so the medicine of like how to embody this in the best way is to turn back towards these other folks in these different relationships to power and harvest what need that they're holding and sort of articulating in their different archetypes. And finally, the 4th archetype is the creator archetype, which is like this ultimate state of creativity and possibility that comes from like weaving through all of these different experiences, and creates possibility where there wasn't before. And you do that by turning towards the wisdom of each of them. So that's a little bit of an overview of that framework. And so I feel like this is useful in interpersonal conflict, because oftentimes conflict is happening because people are at different ones of these, right? So just to know which one you're at, which practices are useful for it, and how to move through those places. So yeah, I'm going to pause there because that's a lot of info, and just allow folks to digest, ask any questions you have. If either Ingrid or Joe, you want to comment on that before we move on to the next one.
Do you have any comments? I was going to go ahead and pose another question from the Q&A that I think that those archetypes serve. And it's anonymous, but several people upvoted it. And this question of, we understand the dominant nature of urgency, but then also folks who have been pushing for this work, maybe often in warrior stance, bring an urgency and an impatience, right? And how do we deal with the fact that it is urgent to get started on the equity work? It is urgent to start. I'm projecting, sorry. It can feel urgent to get started on the equity work and to start on some of these practices. Can you help us think about that tension? Do we slow down there too, or how do we express that urgency in a constructive way?
Does anyone feel called to take that one?
I have one thought, and suspect we can add on that it can be helpful to sense into what's behind the urgency and what's behind the call to slow down. And is the call to slow down because someone is protective of the status quo and uncomfortable with actually addressing the call to address whatever needs to be addressed, or is the call to slow down a sense of we don't need to do this all right in this minute. Let's take some time to really digest this.
Thanks, Joe. I was just going to add one. I think it's such a great question, and the challenge here, or just one that I just want to name, is that depending on our positional power, actually, positional power often gets to decide pace, often gets to decide, if there is a facilitator or if it's someone on staff, if something's going to be resourced, if it will take 6 months or 12 months. And so I just want to name, and I think it's important to recognize our positional power in really setting organizational pace around these kind of efforts. I think that there's opportunities, because I saw that, pacing, time, urgency is our, sort of continual challenge. And there's ways to really integrate this work in a way that can be, at a staff meeting. Maybe there's a staff meeting each month where there's a sense of space to really talk about, it could be organizational values. A lot of times when I work with an organization, the people that are currently there actually don't even know how the values were initially developed. This is how we lose a level of just organizational history. So how did we develop these values? What do they mean to us today? Which ones are the most important to you? And that could be a check-in question for a monthly conversation, where oftentimes the urgency that I've experienced with staff is because they actually don't see real progress or real commitment coming through. And I think that there's an opportunity to integrate it into the ways that we're formally and informally meeting. So, we formally have staff meetings. There's we can allocate 15 minutes to talk about our organizational purpose and what it might mean today. And to really sort of use those opportunities to surface potential other ways to strengthen the team's understanding. That a lot of the times where I feel like I've been brought in around urgency, it's usually, not always, but it's often staff that don't have the same positional power and authority to say, actually, this is really important and we're committing to this. And we're not working for perfection, because there is no such thing. But we're going to commit the next 6 months to really just, collectively understand our values, or to develop a policy or practice for how we will deal with tension and conflict in our organizations. So I just want to put out a call for folks who have positional power. You have a lot of opportunity here to really set and demonstrate commitment. As a lot of times where I often get brought in, it's because there's we said we're going to do this thing, but we didn't do it. And not just about the time, it was the actual commitment to the process and the outcome. And there's an opportunity there for folks with positional power, and also a way to bring in the voices of multiple staff that I just want to throw out. And I'll pass to you, Liam.
Yeah, so in what you're saying, to bring it back to the archetypes, it's the shift from those of us in leadership in organizations, from the role of the typical leader healer to the role of creator, where you're willing to move through your own resistance and your sense of overwhelm and victimization, and your entrenched desire to fight back and defend the way things have been, into a leadership in which you are holding the needs of the folks with the least power in the center and honoring those needs. And I feel like the archetypes is useful for folks with positional power because it can show that, like, regardless of your positional power, you can have these experiences of feeling powerless because you felt powerless in other parts of your life too. And so how do we not get stuck there and be able to actually lead? Yeah, and there are so many other examples we've talked about like ways organizations get entrenched in these different archetypes and stuff. But I do want to uplift one more personal practice around moving through conflict and equity and dominant culture, which is to say that white supremacy culture teaches us to discredit like our deepest, most sacred knowing, right? And so conflicts are an opportunity for us to honor and affirm our own experiences. And so how do we do that? If you move to the next slide, we include in our workbook suggestions for ways to honor your own needs. So for instance, if in a meeting, something comes up and you're feeling rage or you're feeling hurt, like, or intense, like dissociation or something has happened that has like possibly trampled on a need of yours, and it's no longer being honored, or you're no longer in consent with the direction of the group. And it's so important for us to take the time to touch into what we're feeling and to honor that and respect that and go a couple layers deeper into like, it's not that I just need Nancy to send me this thing in this timely way. It's that this points to the desire to like, for respect, you know, for respect of our core agreements that we agreed to, our core values. And so every time that you do that for yourself, you're helping the group come into deeper alignment. And not to say, again, like that BIPOC people should be individually responsible for taking on the burden of self-soothing and then moving the group and all of that. But also, because the outcome of doing that for yourself could be like, oh, wow, the change I need in order to meet these needs in this organization is just not going to happen here. And it's not going to be healthy for me to stay. So I think a lot of us are coming to that place with the great resignation of just like realizing that there's just not enough here to support my needs and to be honored in this space. So the personal practice is, you know, nourishing yourself, listening to your emotions, listening to your needs, and returning to what brings you joy, your ways of like creative expression, your like most inherent ways of knowing and being. That's just like my ancestors have told me many a time. That is how you like fight for justice. Like that's what their highest wish is for all of us, like to not to be able to like express our joy and be ourselves and in our fullness in a way that no one can touch. So just shout out to that.
I see one question in the Q&A I would love to speak to around white women constantly invoking the victim archetype. And as a white woman, I can say that's often we've been trained that that's how we access power, is by asserting our victimhood. And that part of what's really helpful about this framework, similar to the dominant culture characteristics framework, is that it offers us a lens and a way into the conversation that depersonalizes it and names like we all experience these archetypes. We all experience at different moments in our lives these relationships with power, and that invites us to have awareness of when we're in a particular archetype and what is how to support flowing through that archetype and to connect with the medicine that's there, and not get stuck in the pitfalls. Anything you want to add, Liam?
Even as you were speaking, Javita, someone put it as bluntly as you can put it. How do you work through conflict with a power hoarder who is continually evoking the victim archetype? So I know from my own practice, and I'm sure you all do, that that's a true archetype. That there is an archetype right now of folks, particularly white women leaders, who are really struggling with control and moving through that victim archetype. And as you said, people are leaving, right? I mean, a lot of times what you see is when you look at that exodus, a lot of it is that unwillingness to let go of control and enter in this process authentically.
I would say in that case, peer support is really important. And if they don't have that or don't want to access that, that's a problem. Because you can't expect people that don't have the level of positional power you do to resource you through your victim meltdown when you're in charge. Also that match of power hoarders who feel victimized, that's the Syrian dictator. That is the stuff of dictators, most of them on some level seriously feel that they are being oppressed or are at risk of losing their power. So it's just a little reminder, don't be that guy, don't be the dictator, do better.
Ingrid, I don't know if you saw this question, but it was directed to you because you had mentioned tone and it was upvoted. If you have appetite for this one, one of the things that has come up in their work, especially among BIPOC staff, has been disagreement about what is tone policing and what is asking for respectful dialogue and trying to navigate that.
Yeah, thanks, Jean, for lifting that up. And yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to raise is sometimes the idea of sort of tone policing, the way that I've understood it and also have worked with folks, is usually a way to shut down actually the conflict that's trying to come through, by really enacting certain stereotypes as people of color we have to deal with. And so I think what I was trying to lift up is that I think there's a value for articulating a set of agreements around how we will be with each other in a place of conflict, because conflict always doesn't mean that we'll have resolution, right? I mean, it's in that process will actually take time. And if anything, what I've experienced is that conflict sometimes leads to clarity, right? If resolution can happen, that will, that takes time, but there's always a place of clarity and, how it would be in disagreement. And what I mean by tone is actually a place in which sort of referencing the conflict that I was talking about actually is yelling with our colleagues actually it is not acceptable and by any means. But the word that I'm sort of activating to is policing, because I think that there's a way that's what that's saying is I'm going to monitor your behavior. And by policing, some act, and that could be our tone, what might be experienced by, if it's staff of color, is actually you're trying to shut down what I'm trying to raise. And I think that there's ways that we could say, no, actually, we're committed to actually step into these differences. We're committed to be in this process, and we're going to be respectful with with each other as we have this. Because the tone, I know here it's coming as sort of something raised by BIPOC, but I've also been in a lot of conflict where it's this tone that men actually bring to conflict, and actually having to really talk about, no, actually you don't really talk that way, you're actually yelling, and there's an elevated tone, which is actually just not acceptable. And I think this is where leadership is really important, to really name what's acceptable and not acceptable behavior, especially when we're in disagreement and conflict. William and Jovita, I know you all want to add anything.
There's a concrete question here that I think is helpful as we move towards our closure of the time, which is, can you give examples of what agreements about how we'll engage in disagreement look like? Those are kind of structured conversations. And if I recall, there may be some guidance in the workbook about that. But What are some ways of having that conversation? What's an example of an agreement about disagreement?
One thing I've been enjoying doing with some folks I've been coaching lately is creating like feedback user manuals with like, and so they create a little user manual for themselves and their supervisees, and they include in it like just basic things like what my favorite kind of ice cream or whatever, but also things like how do I like to receive feedback? What are the characteristics of feedback for me in terms of like when is best, and the tone and the format, and so to just get clear on because feedback is often the sort of first defense before like a conflict arises. So once you clarify that and make that a regular practice, it often makes more difficult conversations much easier. And I learned that from you, Joe. And so there's that kind of thing, which is fun. You can find creative ways to kind of like just make time to say that explicitly. And then within that, like, what do we do when one of us breaks an agreement? How do we want to be approached? How do we want to agree that we're going to approach it together, because it's going to happen.
And I was just going to add to that, Miriam, is to the question is I've worked with organizations and movement networks where even just articulating, which is sometimes an expectation that we have of each other, is that if I have conflict with Jovita, that I've gone to Jovita about it. That the practice or the commitment is that, first we try to address our conflicts if they are personal. I think someone wrote something in the Q&A that's like, what about personal conflict? Sometimes I think the lack of a process that says, actually, there's an expectation that we'll communicate first directly with each other, and that we'll try to work on a greater understanding, some clarity, and potentially resolution. And then if that doesn't work, well, then who do we both have access to really tap in to support us in this process, right? Like who are the individuals in our organizational system that are really there to support that? And actually just outlining that process in itself is really helpful and has been a really just clarifying to teams. And so I just wanted to also raise that.
That's a fantastic practice. I wonder, since we're nearing time, if we want to move to our closing thoughts. And I think, Jovita, you are going to start us off.
Yeah, just on what Ingrid just shared, we have worked with groups who have things like a collective care committee. This compiled from people with different positional power to be able to be a support when things come up. That's one example. So I just want to say there's so many amazing questions. I feel like we could spend another hour together. Thank you for bringing those questions and all the amazing reflections in the chat. As we've said earlier, we're inviting you to embrace conflict, to normalize, like, tensions happen, mistakes happen, and actually design for that. Like, expect that it will happen, and take the time to attend to the deeper levels of the conflict iceberg, so that we can enter into those moments of tension and conflict with more resources. We pass it to you.
And just to acknowledge, it ain't easy. I teach conflict transformation workshops, and I hate, like, when I'm in a fight with my best friend. Like, it's my least favorite thing in the whole world. Like, we're all just feeling through the dark together, trying to like find our way. And so I'm just grateful. I saw some resources dropped in the chat for other trainings, and please, like, be part of our community of practice and share what you learn. Put out the tools that you come across that's useful to you. And I hope collectively that it moves us towards greater conflict resiliency, myself included.
I love that. Ingrid.
Thanks, Jean. The one thing I just wanted to add is just this amazing moment that we're in. Our organizations are multi-generational, they're multiracial, they're cross-class. There's all kinds of diversity that's in our moment, and we have this opportunity to really build the skill that can only accelerate our work towards our collective purpose. So just thank you all, and just remember to design for conflict. It's there, and what's your process?
Conflict is a portal, y'all.
It's so powerful. Thank you, Ingrid, Liam, and Jovita so much. As I've put in the chat several times, there was an article co-written by them this week that was published in our Leadership Weekly on this Tuesday, and a workbook that Jovita and Liam have offered to us that has amazing tools. It's incredibly accessible. A number of you commented on it already. So those will be coming to you in the follow-up email with the recording, as well as links to some of the things that you posted and the resources that they shared in their slides. So we thank you so much for helping us embrace conflict. And please do complete the evaluation that's about to pop up on your screen for all of us. Appreciate you all. Next month, speaking of conflict, next month, the leadership webinar is around getting beyond donor centrism and actually centering the organization's values and beliefs in its relationships with donors, which is often a source of conflict. So we can continue that through the lens of financial resources next month. Bethany Mackey from Progressive Multiplier is going to join us. Thank you, Liam, Jovita, and Ingrid so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.